In 1933, Germany was broke.
Disarmed, buried under a debt it had no way to pay. 6 years later, its tanks were rolling into Poland at the head of the most powerful military in Europe.
Nobody conjures an army like that out of thin air. So where did the money come from? Follow it, and it doesn't lead you to Berlin. It leads you to a bank on Wall Street.
Almost every documentary about the Second World War starts in the same place. A gray dawn on the 1st of September 1939. German soldiers tearing down the border posts on the Polish frontier.
That's where the shooting started. It isn't where the war was built.
Because the machine that made that morning possible wasn't assembled by generals in 1939. It was assembled over 20 years, in boardrooms, in treasuries, in loan agreements, running in parallel with the story you already know. The failed coup, the burning parliament, the marching columns. This video tells both stories at once, the history and the money underneath it, because you can't understand one without the other.
And it starts not in 1939, but in a railway carriage in a French forest 21 years earlier.
The Bill. November the 11th, 1918. In a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, German delegates signed the armistice that ends the First World War. And here is a detail that will poison everything that follows. When the guns fell silent, German troops were still standing on foreign soil. No enemy had set foot in Germany. To millions of German soldiers, the war didn't feel lost on the battlefield. It felt surrendered from behind. Among them was a 29-year-old corporal, temporarily blinded by mustard gas, recovering in a military hospital in Passewalk. He would later write that, when he heard the news of the surrender, he buried his head in his pillow and wept, and that in that hospital bed, he decided to enter politics. His name was Adolf Hitler.
Out of that moment grew the most dangerous lie of the century, the stab in the back myth.
The idea that Germany hadn't been defeated, it had been betrayed. By politicians, by socialists, by Jews. It was false. The German army was collapsing, and its own generals had demanded the armistice. But the myth didn't need to be true. It needed a bill to attach itself to. And in June 1919, at the Palace of Versailles, in the same Hall of Mirrors where the German Empire had been proclaimed in 1871, the victors delivered one. The war had killed close to 20 million people and gutted a continent. The winners wanted security. Some of them wanted revenge.
And the document they produced didn't just end one war. It quietly laid the groundwork for the next.
The famous piece is Article 231, the so-called War Guilt Clause, which forced Germany to accept responsibility for the war. But that clause wasn't really about morality. It was about money. It was the legal foundation for reparations, the bill for the damage. And in 1921, that bill arrived. 132 billion gold marks. At the time, around $33 billion.
In today's money, very roughly, several hundred billion.
On top of that, Germany lost about 13% of its territory and a tenth of its population, including nearly half of its iron-producing capacity. Its army was capped at 100,000 men. Its navy was gutted and forbidden submarines. To the men who had fought 4 years in the trenches, every clause read like a humiliation. And to the fanatics peddling the stab-in-the-back myth, the treaty was a gift. Proof in writing that Germany's enemies, foreign and domestic, meant to destroy her. One man saw the disaster coming from inside the negotiating rooms. His name was John Maynard Keynes, a British economist who sat in the Paris talks as a Treasury representative, then walked out in disgust. In his 1919 book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, he called the settlement a Carthaginian peace, after Rome's total annihilation of Carthage.
His argument was simple, and it turned out to be devastating.
The reparations were far larger than Germany could realistically pay, and trying to squeeze them out would destabilize everything around them. Aimed deliberately at the impoverishment of Central Europe, he warned, and vengeance would not limp.
But this is where most documentaries get it half right.
The comfortable version says, the treaty was too cruel. Germans grew bitter, and bitterness produced Hitler. There's truth in it, but plenty of historians now argue Germany could have paid more than it actually did, that the deeper problem was often a refusal to pay rather than a genuine inability. What the treaty really did was fuse two explosives together, a wounded nation's rage and a debt that made every economic crisis feel like enemy action.
And in 1923, both went off at once.
When money becomes garbage. January 1923, Germany defaults on deliveries of coal and timber, and French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heart, to take payment in kind. 60,000 soldiers occupying German mines and factories, 5 years after the war ended. German workers answer with passive resistance. They simply stop working.
And to keep paying those idle workers, the government did the one thing a government should never do without limit.
It printed money. Banknotes stacked like firewood. Children building towers out of cash. A wheelbarrow of paper to buy a single loaf of bread. By late 1923, the mark had collapsed to something like 4.2 trillion to $1.
A lifetime of savings could evaporate between breakfast and dinner.
And to watch what that did to the streets. In Munich, on the night of November the 8th, 1923, the very peak of the hyperinflation, the week the currency finally died, a 34-year-old agitator burst into a beer hall with 600 stormtroopers, fired a pistol into the ceiling, and declared a national revolution. The beer hall push. The next morning, Hitler marched 2,000 men toward the center of Munich. Police opened fire. 16 Nazis and 4 policemen died, and Hitler fled, arrested 2 days later. It should have ended him. Instead, the trial made him famous, a national stage for the stab-in-the-back myth, and a sympathetic judge gave him the minimum sentence. In the comfort of Landsberg prison, he dictated a book, Mein Kampf, and he drew the lesson that would change history. Power would not be seized at the barricades. It would be voted in.
But for that, he needed another catastrophe. And for the moment, the catastrophe was canceled by American money.
The Circle. In late 1923, with Europe teetering, a committee was assembled to find a way out, chaired by an American banker named Charles Dawes. The Dawes Plan of 1924 looked technical and dull. It restructured Germany's reparation payments to make them manageable.
But its real effect was to open a door, and through that door poured American money.
Germany got a loan of 800 million gold marks to stabilize its currency, roughly half raised on Wall Street. The bond issue was floated in New York by the House of J.P. Morgan, and American investors, rich and confident in the Roaring '20s, snapped it up almost instantly. Over the next few years, American banks kept lending, until by 1929, well over 10 billion marks in foreign loans had flowed into Germany.
And this is where the story gets genuinely strange, because that money started moving in a circle. Follow it.
American banks lent to Germany. Germany uses the money to pay reparations to France and Britain. France and Britain use those payments to repay their own war debts to the United States. The same dollars leaving New York were sailing to Berlin, then on to Paris and London, then straight back to New York. Round and round. And for 5 years, it looked like it had saved Germany. These were the golden 20s. Under Foreign Minister Gustav Stresemann, Germany signed the Locarno Treaties, joined the League of Nations, shook hands with its former enemies. Berlin became the cultural capital of Europe. Cabarets, cinema, science, more Nobel Prizes than any other country. Unemployment fell, factories hummed, and the Nazi Party rotted in irrelevance. In the 1928 elections, it won 2.6% of the vote. 2.6. A fringe of cranks with a leader most Germans considered finished.
But look at what was actually happening underneath.
Germany wasn't earning the wealth to pay its debts. It was borrowing the money to pay them. The golden 20s, the stability, the democracy itself, all of it stood on one single pillar. That American credit kept flowing.
Cut that river off, and the entire structure was a house of cards waiting for a breath of wind. That breath came in October 1929.
The House of Cards. When Wall Street crashed, American banks did what frightened banks do. They called their money home. The loans holding Germany upright were yanked back almost overnight, and an economy standing entirely on borrowed foreign credit simply folded. Between 1929 and 1932, German industrial production fell by around 40%. Unemployment exploded from roughly 1.4 million to over 6 million. 1 in 3 German workers had no job at all. And in 1931, the banks themselves began to die. The collapse of major institutions like the Danube Bank dragged the financial system down, and ordinary Germans watched, for the second time in a decade, as the institutions of everyday life crumbled in front of them.
And then, the government made it worse.
Terrified of another hyperinflation, Chancellor Heinrich Brüning did the opposite of what a collapsing economy needed. He cut spending, wages, budgets. Austerity poured into a collapse. To many economists since, that looks like malpractice on a national scale. His defenders argue he was boxed in by the gold standard and the reparations. Either way, the misery deepened, and the misery had somewhere political to go.
Because this time, the man from the beer hall was ready.
Now the streets tell the story. Berlin, 1930 to 1932. Brown-shirted stormtroopers and communist militias fighting pitched battles in working-class neighborhoods. Hundreds dead in political violence. Democracy reduced to rule by emergency decree. The Reichstag bypassed. 3 chancellors burned through in 3 years. And with each collapse, the vote moved. September 1930, the Nazis jumped from 2.6% to 18%. July 1932, 37%, the largest party in Germany. Modern research has pinned down the mechanism with uncomfortable precision. A study by economists, including Hans Joachim Voth, traced Nazi support not just to unemployment, but specifically to the banking crisis of 1931. Cities more exposed to the failing banks saw sharply higher Nazi voting, even after accounting for lost income.
Which is worth pausing on. It wasn't only hunger that built Hitler's base. It was the sight of the banks themselves going under.
Hitler offered himself as a man who would rescue Germany from the wreckage. Tear up the hated treaty, avenge the stab in the back, rebuild the army, put people back to work. And money was flowing to the party too, though less freely than the popular story suggests. The historian, Henry Ashby Turner, showed most big industrialists hedged their bets, backing conservatives. The steel magnate, Fritz Thyssen, was a great exception, an early, enthusiastic funder who would later break with Hitler and end up in a concentration camp himself. Then came the backroom deal. On the 30th of January 1933, President Hindenburg, an 85-year-old war hero who privately despised the Bohemian corporal, appointed Hitler Chancellor of Germany. No majority, no coup. Conservative power brokers around Franz von Papen believed they had hired him, boxed him in, and would control him. Within 2 months, Papen boasted, "We will have pushed Hitler so far into a corner that he'll squeak."
They were catastrophically wrong.
4 weeks later, the Reichstag burned. Hitler used the fire to suspend civil liberties overnight. By March, the Enabling Act let him rule without parliament. By summer, every other political party was banned. The first concentration camp had opened at Dachau, and the stormtroopers who had brawled in the streets now wore the authority of the state. German democracy, the democracy the American loans had propped up, was dead within 6 months.
And now we reach the part of the story nobody puts on a poster.
In October 1936, the U.S. ambassador to Nazi Germany, William Dodd, wrote to President Roosevelt with an unsettling observation. More than 100 American corporations, he reported, had subsidiaries or standing arrangements inside Nazi Germany.
Not a handful, more than 100.
Start with Henry Ford, a committed anti-Semite whose own writing fed directly into Nazi ideology. His newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, pushed the myth of a Jewish conspiracy, later bound into volumes titled The International Jew. Hitler read them in translation, kept a portrait of Ford in his office, and praised him by name in Mein Kampf. In 1938, Hitler awarded Ford the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, the highest honor the regime could give a foreigner. Ford accepted it. His German company, Ford Werk in Cologne, ran right through the Nazi years, turning out thousands of military trucks and half-tracks. A 1945 U.S. Army report described it as an arsenal of Nazism. Then General Motors, whose Opel division was the biggest car maker in Germany. Together, Ford and GM's German operations controlled around 70% of the German car market when war broke out. Capacity retooled to build the trucks that would carry German armies into Poland, France, and the Soviet Union.
But the most chilling case isn't about trucks. It's about information.
The Nazi state made heavy use of Hallworth punch card machines, early data processing technology, supplied through IBM's German subsidiary, Die Homag. That technology helped power the census and cataloging operations the regime used to identify and track people, including Jews. The journalist, Edwin Black, argues these machines organized the logistics of persecution down to operations inside the camps. Some historians consider his strongest claims overstated, but the underlying fact isn't in dispute. A single punch card looks like nothing at all. Multiplied across a bureaucracy of murder, it becomes something else entirely. And there is Standard Oil of New Jersey, cooperating with the German chemical giant IG Farben on the synthetic fuel Germany would need to keep its military moving. A name to remember, because IG Farben would go on to manufacture the poison gas used in the death camps, and to run a plant at Auschwitz built on slave labor.
Now, an important disclaimer. This isn't a story about a secret cabal running the war from a boardroom. It wasn't that. And it didn't need to be.
Several of these companies lost control of their German subsidiaries once America entered the war. The degree of knowledge and guilt varies case by case, and serious historians argue about it. But the documented facts are damning enough. By late 1941, U.S. corporate investment in Nazi Germany ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars. Ford, GM, IBM, Standard Oil, but also Kodak, Singer, Coca-Cola, ITT. Some kept operating through the war. Some used forced labor.
And here's a detail that says the quiet part out loud.
After the war, General Motors sued the U.S. government and won, recovering around $32 million in compensation for bomb damage to its German factories. Ford collected just under $1 million for Cologne. American planes bombed factories owned by American companies, building equipment for the enemy, and American taxpayers helped cover the repair bill. It's all in the archives, in congressional records, in the Nuremberg evidence.
It just doesn't fit on a poster. So, we followed the money into Germany. Now watch how it becomes tanks. And then watch how the tanks become inevitable.
The miracle that wasn't. The man who turned debt into an army was Hjalmar Schacht, Hitler's central bank president from 1933 and economics minister from 1934. His problem was brutal. Hitler wanted a vast army immediately, but building one meant spending money Germany didn't have, on a scale forbidden by Versailles, and doing it openly risked a French invasion before the army existed.
So Schacht hit it.
He set up a shell company, the Metallurgical Research Corporation, or Mefo, and had it place enormous military orders with German industry, paying not with cash, but with IOUs. The Mefo bills, secretly guaranteed by the Reichsbank. In plain terms, the state was borrowing from itself and hiding the bill inside a fake company's books. On paper, rearmament looked privately funded. In reality, it was government borrowing on a colossal scale. Off the books, out of sight. And while the money stayed hidden, the results marched in public. March 1935, Hitler announces conscription and a new air force, shredding Versailles. The world protests and does nothing. March 1936, German troops re-enter the demilitarized Rhineland. It was a colossal bluff. The army had orders to retreat at the first sign of French resistance. But France didn't move. Unemployment, near 30% when Hitler took power, was practically gone by 1938. To Germans who had survived hyperinflation and depression, it felt like a miracle. And the man from the beer hall took the credit.
But here's the trap.
The economic miracle was a war economy in disguise, a machine for turning hidden debt into tanks, aircraft, and guns. And a machine like that has a fatal property built into it. It can't stop. By 1937, imports of food and raw materials were being strangled to feed the arms factories. By 1938, the Mefo bills were coming due, and the regime was reduced to raiding banks, savings, and insurance funds. Schacht himself warned the spending was unsustainable and was pushed out, replaced by men who would never say no. And now watch how the ledger starts writing the map. March 1938. German troops march into Austria, the Anschluss, greeted by cheering crowds. What the newsreels didn't show: the Reichsbank seizing Austria's gold and foreign reserves, roughly 90 tons of gold, more than nearly bankrupt Germany had left in its own vaults. September 1938, Munich. Britain and France hand Hitler the Sudetenland for a promise of peace. March 1939, he takes the rest of Czechoslovakia anyway, along with the Czech army's entire arsenal, the Skoda Works, one of the great arms factories of Europe, and tens of millions in Czech gold. Part of it infamously transferred to Berlin through the Bank for International Settlements with the Bank of England's cooperation.
Every conquest was a bailout, and that is the darkest logic out of the whole thing.
Germany had almost none of what a modern war machine runs on. Not enough oil, not enough iron, not enough rubber, not even enough food. The only way to keep the machine fed, the only way to make the numbers work, was to take those resources from somewhere else. In the mind of the Nazi leadership, the conquest of Lebensraum in the East wasn't an ideological fantasy layered on top of the economy. It was wired into the economy's very structure.
The war wasn't a departure from the economic plan. On some level, it was the plan. It sounds insane. It was also, in its own monstrous way, perfectly logical. Build an economy you can only feed by conquest, and you've built a countdown to war.
The war the ledger demanded. August the 23rd, 1939. The world is stunned. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, sworn ideological enemies, sign a non-aggression pact. Everyone remembers the secret clause carving up Poland. Almost nobody remembers the other half of the deal, a trade agreement. Soviet grain, oil, and raw materials would flow west to feed the German war machine, in exchange for German industrial technology. Hitler had just solved his resource problem, temporarily, with a signature. 9 days later, on the 1st of September 1939, the tanks crossed into Poland. Britain and France declared war. The Second World War had begun.
And here's what the economics tells you that the battle maps don't. Germany couldn't afford a long war, so it had to win short ones.
This is what Blitzkrieg really was. Not just a tactic, but a financial necessity. Strike fast, win in weeks, seize the enemy's resources before your own run out. Poland fell in 5 weeks, Denmark in a day, Norway, Holland, Belgium in weeks. And in May 1940, the unthinkable. France, the great military power of Europe, the victor of Versailles, collapsed in 6 weeks. Hitler danced his little jig at Compiègne and made the French sign the surrender in the same railway carriage of 1918. And each victory paid for itself. Occupied France was billed for its own occupation, 20 million Reichsmarks a day. Factories, food, fuel, art, gold, everything flowed to Germany. Conquest had become the business model.
But there was one target the whole system had always pointed at.
June the 22nd, 1941. Operation Barbarossa. 3 million men invade the Soviet Union, the largest invasion in human history. In the hours before the attack, Soviet grain trains were still rolling west across the border, delivering the raw materials of the pact. Ideology called it a crusade against Bolshevism. The ledger called it something simpler: Ukrainian grain, Caucasus oil, the resources that would make the Reich unbeatable, seized from the one supplier Germany could never trust. And the ledger is why the war in the East broke the way it did. In 1942, Hitler split his southern armies to chase the oil fields of the Caucasus, Maikop, Grozny, Baku, telling his generals, in effect, that without that oil, the war was lost. The drive stalled, and on the road to the oil stood a city on the Volga, Stalingrad. 5 months of the most savage urban fighting in history. In February 1943, the German Sixth Army, 91,000 frozen survivors of what had been 250,000 men, surrendered in the rubble.
The tide had turned, and from here, the money tells the story of the collapse.
Germany's answer was to squeeze harder. Under Albert Speer, war production actually rose into 1944, but it ran on the labor of millions of forced workers and concentration camp prisoners, the final monstrous stage of the war economy. I.G. Farben's plant at Auschwitz, slave labor under the factories that American bombers, and sometimes American lawsuits, would later reach. Then the Allies did what the Reich had always feared. They attacked the fuel. From May 1944, American bombers systematically destroyed the synthetic fuel plants, the very technology Standard Oil's cooperation had once helped advance. Production of aviation fuel collapsed by over 90%. The Luftwaffe planes sat grounded. New pilots couldn't even train. In December 1944, Hitler's last great gamble in the Ardennes was built on a plan so desperate it sounded invented. The Panzer divisions were ordered to capture American fuel depots along the way, because Germany no longer had enough petrol to reach the objectives. They ran dry short of them. By the spring of 1945, the machine that could never stop finally stopped. Soviet shells falling on Berlin, the Reich's gold hidden in mines, its cities in ruins, its currency worthless for the second time in a generation. The economy built on conquest died the moment it could no longer conquer.
And then came the reckoning at Nuremberg. The money got the softest sentences of all.
Hjalmar Schacht, the financial architect of rearmament, stood trial with the top Nazi leadership and was acquitted. Directors of I.G. Farben and Krupp were convicted for slave labor and plunder. Most were free within a few years, and some returned to boardrooms of post-war German industry. And the American corporations, as we've seen, collected compensation. The generals hanged. The financiers, with few exceptions, walked.
So, what does the clean story get wrong? 4 things.
That the war's origins were only political. They weren't. From the stab-in-the-back myth to the burning Reichstag, every political turning point stood on a financial one. A treaty that fused rage with debt, and a credit system so fragile that when it broke in 1929, it took a democracy with it. That Hitler's rise was inevitable. Before the crash, his party polled under 3%, and its leader was a failed pushist. Without the Depression, without the banking panic of 1931, there's a real argument it stays there. That international money was a footnote. The loans hailed as triumphs of diplomacy. Charles Dawes won a Nobel Prize for his. Didn't stabilize Europe. They wired it to a detonator. And the war itself, from Blitzkrieg to Barbarossa to the last dry fuel tanks in the Ardennes, followed the logic of resources as much as the logic of generals. And that Western business with the regime was a minor embarrassment. Trucks, fuel, technology, financing. The Third Reich got them, in part, from firms whose executives wore Nazi medals and whose factories, in some cases, ran on slave labor. Most faced no real reckoning afterward.
Nearly 80 years on, why does any of this still matter?
Because the forces underneath it never went away. Economic collapse still opens the door to extremism. Financial panic still eats at democracies from the inside, and the connection between money and power is still buried under so many layers of complexity that most people never dig down to it. The tidy version of the Second World War teaches real lessons. Beware the dictator. Defend democracy. Never forget the Holocaust. But it's incomplete. Catastrophes on this scale don't fall out of the sky. They get assembled, slowly, out of thousands of ordinary decisions. A treaty meant to secure peace. Loans meant to stabilize an economy. Business deals meant to create jobs and profit.
Each one, on its own, looked reasonable. Together, they built a road to the worst thing that ever happened.
Keynes had predicted it in 1919, aimed to impoverish Central Europe, and vengeance would not limp. It didn't. The vengeance came through a beer hall in Munich, a burning parliament in Berlin, a frozen city on the Volga. Tens of millions of people died, and a chilling amount of the structure that made it possible had been built, financed, and profited from by the very nations that would later spend everything to tear it down.
That's the part the clean story leaves out.
This wasn't only a war of armies and generals, of good against evil. It was also a war of debts that couldn't be paid, of capital that went wherever the profit beckoned, of an economy engineered until conquest became the only way to keep it alive. The people living through it watched it get built one decision at a time, and almost none of them saw where it led.
The next crisis rarely announces itself either. It just begins, quietly, the way this one did. Not with an invasion, but with a bill someone couldn't pay. If this has reframed the way you see the war, that's what this channel is for. History told through the money underneath it. The debts, the deals, and the quiet decisions the standard story leaves out. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.